I did an episode a couple of weeks ago called Calm the Hell Down, in which I argue, among other things, that we shouldn't think about AI as being intelligent, as having a mind, as being an agent, or anything along those lines. Today, I'm going to talk with Shannon Vallor. She's the Bailey Gifford Chair in the Ethics of Data and Artificial Intelligence at the Edinburgh Futures Institute at the University of Edinburgh, and she's also in the philosophy department there. She thinks that we need to jettison the idea or the metaphor of AI as having a mind. And rather, what we should do is think about AI, especially large language models or generative AI, as being mirrors of a sort, which is why she titled her new book, The AI Mirror. Now, it's not just about getting the wrong metaphor for, I don't know, literary purposes or something along those lines. The problem is that if we get the wrong metaphor, then we're going to think about AI in the wrong way. This is what Shannon argues. And it makes it the case that it's hard to use AI then. It's hard to create the appropriate guardrails for AI. It's hard to figure out which of our fears are grounded versus which are ungrounded. And so the general idea is if we can jettison that bad metaphor of AI as a mind and introduce this metaphor of AI as a mirror, we're going to do better on all those fronts. And the conversation actually takes lots of twists and turns. We end with this really interesting thought about how we should think about comparing AI to people. Usually, what we'll do is, and I think guilty is the right word, I'm guilty of this. We think about, hey, is the AI good or better than people as they're currently constituted? And one of the things that Shannon pushes me on rightly is we shouldn't just compare it to what humans are right now. We should think about how humans could perform, how smart they could be if they get the right kinds of socioeconomic supports, the right kinds of, for instance, educational opportunities. So we've got all these resources. We could pour them into AI. We could also pour some of them into humans to make them better as well. And so maybe there are cases in which AI would not outperform people if we supported people in the right kinds of way. Anyway, we'll get to that conversation at the end, and it's a really interesting point and well worth thinking about. All right. Anyway, that's the ground we'll cover, among other things. I'm Reed Blackman, your host. Questions, comments, trenchant criticism, em@reedblackman.com. And that's it. There's no sort of big concepts, nothing particularly hard to understand. Thankfully, Shannon does a great job of articulating her view without the use of any jargon. So nothing to clarify. I hope you enjoy the conversation. Let's go talk to Shannon. So, Shannon, from what I gather, your position is something like we're thinking about AI all wrong, and that's leading us to do the wrong things with them, ethically speaking. And this sort of flows from a mistaken metaphor that we use for thinking about AI. So, if that's right, can you say a little bit about what that mistaken metaphor is and how it makes us go awry?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the metaphor, oddly enough, is ourselves. It's the metaphor of a human mind as a
Mm.
way of understanding what an AI model does. And that's the metaphor that we've been led to rely on through a century or more of science fiction narratives that envision the future of artificial intelligence as the future of machine minds. And so it's a metaphor because that's not what they are. They're not minds. And most sober machine learning researchers will tell you that all day long, that they know they're not building minds. But because we were for so long developing narratives of AI that inevitably led to machine minds, we are in this state of confusion where we think we must be dealing with something that, if it is not yet a mind, it must be similar to or structured like or approximating a mind. So that's the best model or metaphor to use to understand what we're dealing with. And so I wrote the book, The AI Mirror, as a way to explain that, in fact, these kinds of AI tools. So my book is focused on a specific class of AI technologies, not all machine learning, all things that get the label of AI, but a very specific type of AI that we build, the type that has led to things like large language models and generative AI. The book is focused on that approach, which from an engineering standpoint is much more like building a mirror than it is building a mind.
Mm.
And when we use that mirror, as I unpack in the book in various ways, it actually gets us much closer to an accurate understanding of what these tools can do for us and what they can't, what their strengths and limitations are, why they are good at what they're good at, why they fail in the ways they fail, what fears are reasonable to have about them, and what fears are not reasonable to have at this moment, and what hopes are reasonable and which hopes are not grounded in reality. And so the book is really first about setting right our understanding of AI technologies so that we can relate to them in ways that are beneficial to us, that don't debilitate us, that don't undermine our institutions or our social fabric. And ultimately, and this is, I think, the most important theme of my book, that don't place us in a position of passivity and loss of control when it comes to shaping our future.
Okay, so there's a lot there. I want to explore this. Let's not think about it as a mind. I think that's probably right. And then I want to hear about why the mirror metaphor helps us more. So let's start with the mind stuff. So I take it that one thing that a lot of, I think, computer scientists, engineers, data scientists like to say is something like our brain is a computer and our mind is a software that's running on that. And that's how we should think about the human mind, the human brain. And so, similarly, what we've got here is just different hardware and different software, but it's more or less functionally equivalent. It's the same stuff going on. There's lots of reasons to push back, but is there something that you find
So
particularly misguided about that?
you've exposed something really excellent about this particular situation that we're in, which is one of the things that has allowed us to make this mistake is that we have, within certain communities, accepted a metaphor for the mind that's a mistake, the
Yeah,
metaphor of the mind as computer. Now,
yeah,
what I want to say about that is I've had countless computer scientists tell me that's what a mind is.
totally.
I have had very few neuroscientists and cognitive scientists. That's an
Oh, that's
appropriate
interesting. Yeah,
frame of mind, right?
or for that matter, right?
Yeah, but nobody trusts what philosophers say about the
Yeah,
mind,
totally. Yeah,
right? And I'm fine with that. It's the people who study the actual mechanics of brains who understand that they don't work like computers.
yeah,
Or if they work like computers, they're computers of a sort that bear very little resemblance to the computers that we actually use in the world
yeah.
today, right? If they're
So what?
typical computers working on a very different kind of hardware and a very different kind of architecture. But many neuroscientists and cognitive scientists I work with don't even think a computer is the right analogy to use
Right.
to describe the
And
mind.
why is that? I agree, but why is that? What is there a sort of a suite of common objections that cognitive scientists and neuroscientists will objections that they raise, or is there the one that they all say, "Listen, this is just fundamentally misguided for the following reason"?
No, you know what? It would be much easier if it was the latter because we would have this sort of one
Yeah,
decisive reason that it's not a computer, but the brain is too complex for that to be the case, right? The reason why it doesn't work is actually quite complicated and has to do with the way that the brain is not actually a simple organ, but one that is scaffolded and layered upon many subsystems that perform different functions in the body and that are linked to different parts of the body. So, one of the common threads I would say in the objection is that, in fact, the brain is just a part of the mind. It's the most important part,
mhm,
but the mind is how the brain experiences the body. And so the body has a great deal to do with how the mind functions, the rest of the
mhm,
body besides the brain. So the brain is just part of the body, but the brain is linked up to the rest of the body in ways that determine how the mind works. So just to give you a simple example of this, right? One of the most interesting discoveries of the last few decades was the discovery that neurons do not just exist in your brain, that there are neurons in your intestines and that the neurons in your
oh,
intestines are actually functioning in a way that's coordinated with your brain. And things like depression,
mm,
for example, might be as much about what's happening in our gut as about what's happening inside the brain. Hormones are something that actually flow in the blood and are produced in various parts of the body outside of the brain, but they cross the blood brain barrier and powerfully affect how the mind functions.
sure,
Nerves, right? The efferent nerve system, the peripheral nerves that are linked to our brain are an incredibly important part of understanding how the brain experiences and understands the physical world and solves problems that arise in the physical world, and how the brain actually makes sense of the physical world through concepts and language. So we've got one model of the mind that, frankly, most neuroscientists I know are highly skeptical of, which treats the mind as a symbolic processing engine
Hmm.
and therefore thinks, oh, that's what software and hardware is together, is a symbolic processing engine. So it's just the same stuff. And then they think of the body as merely the container or the casing for
Right.
the engine. But in fact, neuroscientists and biologists understand that it's actually a holistic system that is tightly integrated and that actually cannot be separated into symbolic and non-symbolic components. It's the non-symbolic parts of our embodiment that allow our brain to do symbolic work. Long story short, it's about the body and not just the brain part of the body, but the whole body. That is the reason why it is not simply software running on a hardware system.
Yeah, I think you could actually say something like it is a hardware thing. It's just there's a lot more hardware involved. It's not just the
And that's
hardware
our
that's inside of our skull. There's other kinds of things. Hormones are not hardware. That's I don't even know where to place it
that's
in that metaphor.
but that's exactly right. That like
Yeah.
the hardware metaphor, if you stretch it far enough, it just breaks or it becomes
Yeah.
meaningless. Like any metaphor, if it begins to explain everything, then the metaphor loses its meaning, right?
So we can even grant, for the sake of argument, that a computer is like a brain. And let's just say, sure, that's fine. And then we can say, but to be clear, our brain is not alone sufficient to make our minds what they are. There's all this other non brain stuff. Fine, I'll grant you. I don't think this is true, but for the sake of argument, that the hardware on my laptop is akin to the hardware that's inside my skull, but that doesn't get you anything like our minds because our minds are comprised of and or influenced by so much more than what's inside of our skulls.
Yeah, except I won't grant because there's a whole set of other arguments why the hardware and software in my computer is very unlike the neuronal structures and processing structures in my brain, which again include the hormones, include
Yes.
so the things that don't fit are also in the brain. And computers don't
Yeah.
have things like
Neurochemicals, serotonin.
they don't have neurotransmitters. They don't have things states like arousal. Don't have the things that allow us to experience the flow of time in and the kind of subjectivity of sentience, the ability to feel things, the ability to have positive and negatively valued states of experience that feel bad or good. We don't have anything in the computer that can support that kind of phenomenon.
I think this is totally right, but let me push back on behalf of the overly competent data scientist. Suppose I say, okay, look, what you're talking about is the sort of full blown mindedness, which includes experience and feelings, emotions, feelings of arousal, actual arousal. Okay, fine, I'll grant you that we can't get that stuff. But there is this thing that's a subset of all of, call it mindedness, which is the intellect. It's the thinking part. It's the reasoning part. It's the rationality part. And can't we get just that bit? So fine, we don't have all the hardware and the non-hardware things. We have a bit of the hardware and we can process thoughts, just the
Yep.
almost like mechanical reasoning or something along those lines. We can get the reasoning going even if we can't get experience or subjectivity or whatever you want to call it as well.
What I will say is the answer to that is no for the most part. We can't get thoughts. We can't get understanding. We can't get reasoning. And I'll explain why. We can get a certain kind of symbolic processing according to certain rules. And that's what any computer does. So
Sure.
again, that sets the bar too low because if that's all it takes, then the simplest kinds of computing systems that we had 50 years ago were minds, right? My thermostat is a mind because it can sense the temperature and then automatically turn the heat on or off. We don't want to be able to say like systems that are that simple are doing what's for us the important cognitive work of minds. But to get to things like understanding and reasoning and thought in any sense that's meaningfully comparable to humans, you actually have to have those physical experiences that are the base ground for abstract thought. So the problem is that our cognitive hardware is grafted on all the lower animal parts. That's how we evolved. It didn't evolve. Our cognitive hardware, if you want to use that metaphor temporarily, did not evolve as a separate organ sitting
Hmm.
independently of or just loosely linked to a bunch of
Right.
other
Like you
systems.
take a prefrontal cortex and you just glue it onto what was already there.
Yeah, no, that's not how the brain works, right? The
Right.
brain is massively parallel, massively interconnected, incredibly plastic, and every part of it talks to every other part of it in
Hmm.
ways that we barely understand. And so you
Hmm.
can't just lift the higher order parts off and say they would work without the lower order parts.
Yeah.
So in the same way, you can't look at what a computer is doing that has none of these animal parts and
Yeah.
say, oh, but it's still doing the same stuff at the top level. Whatever it's doing, and it's doing something, is not like what our brain is doing. And so you can either misunderstand it or you can give it a different name. So call it processing, right? Call it problem solving, call it pattern matching, right? Use the language that's appropriate for what you've got there, which are symbolic processing systems that are in different ways driven either by kind of stochastic algorithms or by deterministic algorithms that prescribe a sort of single path. But either way, it doesn't fit the model of the human brain. But the balance of the evidence suggests that the comparison of brains to computers is a poor one, or at least a very shallow and superficial one.
I want to not push back, may slightly push back on behalf of the data scientist. Suppose I say, all right, look, Shannon, you've convinced me. Not a great metaphor. There's ways in which it just doesn't quite work for the reason that you articulated. Okay. But look, at the end of the day, I just want a metaphor that's useful.
Mhm.
And I find it, this is not me, this is me speaking in the voice of of the imagined recalcitrant data scientist. I think it's very useful. I find it very useful in how I think about my own interactions with, say, ChatGPT or a Claude or a Gemini or whatever. I think other people, consumers, they find it useful to think about it as a kind of mind. That's why we made it a chatbot interface. And so, yeah, okay, look, fine, technically, academically, you look into the fine details, and this metaphor is not going to pan out as an accurate representation of what we've actually built, but it's sufficiently useful such that we should just keep going with it.
And I would say a metaphor isn't useful if it leads you to make mistakes. And the metaphor leads people to make mistakes.
Yeah, how,
Let me give you a sort of very obvious example. So take someone like Jeffrey Hinton, who is so captured by this metaphor
yeah,
that he comes out and makes claims like the large language models that we have can even feel things like fear, even though they don't have emotions in the sense that we do and they don't have bodies to feel fear. Okay, this is someone who does not understand the physics of fear,
yeah,
right? Fear is a physical reaction that is experienced by the brain as a result of a certain state of the body, right? And it doesn't actually manifest as fear without those sort of hormones, without that excitement of the nervous system, without those
mhm,
things that support fear in animals, sentient animals. But Hinton is confused because he's been so drawn out by this computational metaphor onto a ledge. And he's so confident because he knows his field well, right? That
yeah,
he thinks he can make this jump over to understanding what the brain is. And he makes these mistakes that, frankly, when he started talking about these systems being able to experience fear, I know tons of computer scientists who are just cringing at this and going, oh
yes,
my God, it's so embarrassing. Why is he saying this?
yeah.
It's because the metaphor led you out on that ledge and you fell off. So a metaphor that leads you that far from the truth is not a useful one. And it leads people into mistakes of other sorts. So if you think about the ways that a chatbot works, if you start thinking you're dealing with a mind and a mind that has thoughts and understanding, then once you see that the chatbot can solve a pretty complex problem relating to the physical world, where it seems to give you the right answer in a way that in a human mind would imply a capacity to understand and think about that scenario in the world, you would immediately and reasonably infer that if it understood that scenario that well, it could work through a simpler version of the problem in that physical environment that involved all the same concepts and solve the simpler problem. Now, what I'm referring to here is an example that was widely publicized back in April as a result of something that was flagged by Douglas Hofstadter. If you know who he is, some of your
Sure.
authors might have read him back in the 90s. So Hofstadter flagged this to some other researchers who wrote up a blog post about the fact that the leading generative models, Gemini at the time, the model underneath Microsoft Copilot, and ChatGPT, were all failing to solve a puzzle that was extremely simple.
Hmm.
And it was the puzzle that asked, a man is on the bank of a river. He has a goat and a boat. How does he get the goat safely across the river? Now, a 6-year-old can answer that correctly.
Sure.
Why could all of these models not answer? And by the way, the blog post shows the answers that they gave, which each violate the laws of physics about 12 times
Yeah.
and contradict themselves and just make a mess of the whole
Yes.
problem.
Take the goat across first, then go back, get the boat, take the boat across, stupid things like
Right.
that. Yeah.
Okay. That should tell you that you are not dealing with a mind that is thinking through the situation and the problem and understanding the scenario. What you're dealing with is a system that understands the pattern that normally ties together those words in the question. And the
Sure.
pattern, of course, that it's trying to replicate is the pattern of a more complicated version of the
Yeah.
scenario. It's the man who has the goat and the wolf and
Right. And the
the
chicken.
rabbit or
And yeah.
whatever, right? And
Yes.
one thing will
Yeah.
eat the other if they're left alone together. So the man has to make a much more complex set of choices about how to
Yeah.
get all those things safely across the river. That should tell you right there that these models don't understand the situation, even when they get the complicated one right.
Yeah. If I can summarize then, it sounds to me like when I push back on behalf of the data scientist and I say, look, but it's super useful. I find it useful. I think you've highlighted two ways in which it's actually not useful and in fact counterproductive. The first one is something like misattribution of features that it doesn't have. Like it's experiences fear, it has regrets before like it's a full-blown agent that deserves rights. So it goes down an insane path of attributing sentience and consciousness, and eventually you're probably going on the path towards moral worth or something along those lines if you keep
Yep.
going. And so it's misattribution that could eventually lead to really bizarre worldviews, both ethical and otherwise. And the second kind of thing that I heard you say is something like, and it's related, it's overconfidence in what the thing can do. So if you use the metaphor of the mind, you begin to think, oh, this is a thinking thing. We have ample evidence it's not a thinking thing. Simple goat puzzle is an example that it's not actually thinking. If it did understand, it wouldn't make such a stupid mistake. It made such a stupid mistake, therefore it's not actually understanding, not actually reasoning. And so when you have overconfidence in a technology or any tool for that matter, that's of course going to lead to everything from hiccups to disaster.
Yeah, exactly. And so I think the metaphor is very useful as a marketing strategy, but it's not
Yeah.
very useful
Right.
for any other purpose. And it's actually harmful when it leads people to misunderstand the capabilities of the tool they're using. And as you point out, not only over rely on it, but also attribute features to it that can cause us to be captured by fears that aren't reasonable. So
Yeah.
part of my book deals with the existential risk. These systems are going to turn on us. They're going to enslave us. They're going to decide that we're the enemy, right?
Yeah.
And you only go down that road of delusion if you've made this
Yeah.
first more basic and understandable
Yeah.
mistake of thinking you're
Yeah.
dealing with a mind.
Yeah. I like that you characterize it as delusion. That's what it strikes me as exactly. And so I see a lot of people who, on the one hand, they do think it's just false that we're dealing with a mind here, but they're also at the same time endorsing something like we need massive safety regulations because the AI is going to take over. It's pick a lane.
Yeah.
I think we can calm the hell down in many respects because the
Well,
not all respects, but in many respects to do with existential fears because it relies upon a complete misconception of what we're dealing with.
that's right. And so it causes us to not be able to separate the fears that are grounded from the fears that are not. So one of the things that often happens in the debate about these systems is there's a confusion between the worries about AI that turns on us because it's sentient or because it wants things or whatever, from the actual quite realistic fear about things like reward hacking. So for
Hmm.
those audience who might not know what reward hacking is, it's when you specify the objective function, which is the goal that you've told the system it should optimize for, where you misspecify that in a way without realizing it that will lead the machine to achieve the goal in a way that's actually harmful to us. And the simplest version of this that I use when I explain this to students is I say, look, imagine that you're designing a robot barista and you want to get the best and most efficient robot barista that you can. And it's got a natural language understanding capacity so that you can just tell it what you want instead of coding it. And it will just convert this into its objective function. So you tell the robot barista, your objective, your primary objective is to deliver the coffee to the customer as quickly as you can. Now, how is the robot going to solve that problem? Most of
Sure.
the students don't take very long to realize that the shortest path to the customer is probably throwing the coffee at them.
Sure.
It didn't say you had to hand the coffee in a cup,
Yeah.
right? The instruction was get the coffee to the customer as fast as possible. The
The human
fastest
head
is
and put it where the mug should be instead of dispensing the espresso into the mug. Just take a human head and put it under there
yeah,
and let it just
grab the
like
head, put
lean
it out
in.
of spout. Yeah, that's
Yeah.
probably even better, right?
Yeah.
And so when you take students through this example, you can help them see that something like reward hacking has nothing to do with the robot being evil, has nothing, this robot hasn't got a thing going on consciousness wise. It's solving a mathematical optimization problem in exactly, according to exactly the criteria you gave it. So I like to tell people most of software engineering is trying to close the gap between what you told the machine to do and what you thought you told it to do. So you can explain these safety issues that we do have to regulate and do have to govern,
Sure.
because a system that has the wrong objective function that's hooked into the power grid is going to cause potentially horrific damage, right, to human beings and communities. But that's not because it's a mind. So once
Yeah.
you understand the distinction, you can still talk about real risks like misspecification of the objective function without attributing these to internal desires of the machine to harm people.
I think that's basically right. I do have one caveat, though, I think you'll probably be sympathetic with, which is that I do see in some cases where people are raising this kind of concern, there's existential concerns by virtue of misspecifying or underspecifying what the objective function is, what the goal should be, and then you plug it into the electric grid system and blah, blah, blah. Suddenly nuclear weapons are going off. I do think that in some cases people are smuggling in the premise that the thing is intelligent and smart because they'll say, you set it, you give it this goal, like optimize the energy distribution or whatever it is. And then, and this is the unsaid part, because it's super duper smart, it's going to figure out crazy shit to do that's going to kill humanity.
Yeah.
And that's just a different way of smuggling in the mind theory or the theory that this thing is a mind or has a mind and is intelligent. When in fact, no, it's still stupid. And yes, it might come up with interesting ways of pursuing a better, more efficient distribution, but it's still not going to figure out how to hack by itself the federal government's blah, blah, blah to use nuclear weaponry to better distribute energy with whatever the crazy thing is. So I agree that the sort of unintended consequence from the objective function that we set is a legit concern, but I do think that people go too quickly to, and then it can do crazy things in pursuit of that goal, and that's where the existential risk is. It depends on what are the crazy things it's supposed to be able to do. Does it have the intelligence to do that? I mean, what's the probability of that? And I think people are really bad about thinking about what the means to the ends are and how high the probability is.
I'll say one thing, maybe to give those people a little bit more credit. So we are seeing, again, it's quite impressive what these systems can do without understanding a damn thing, right? Without being smart at all, they can actually still accomplish a lot.
Yeah.
And so when we are seeing the development of agentic AI systems, which I don't love that terminology because again, it leads people down the mind metaphor. Like, oh,
Yeah.
it's an agent.
Totally.
Oh, it thinks.
Yeah.
Oh, it
Yeah.
no,
Yeah.
it doesn't. But fine, what we mean in the very narrow sense by agentic AI is AI that has been designed in such a way that it can step out of the task environment into a different task environment and execute tasks that then allow it to come back and do other things to solve your problem. So it's the thing that can enter into multiple different task environments, let's say on the internet. And so it's something that can do lots of different things for you and then perhaps combine tasks to in ways that we wouldn't expect. And if
Sure.
you combine that with large language models, again, which don't understand anything, however, they often can nevertheless get the correct solution because someone on the internet once wrote it down, right? Where a few people wrote things that, when triangulated statistically, lead to the correct answer. Again, it's not smart. It can't figure these things out on its own, but it does have access to a large language corpus, which may contain suggestions of the direction in which the solution lies. And then if you have paired it with the ability to independently enter other digital environments and do things, you can see how they get to this fear, right?
Yeah.
Of a machine that somehow steps out of the box and ends up doing something very harmful and unexpected.
I
I think
yeah.
the
I
scenarios are usually very contrived where that would
Yes.
happen, but
Right.
I admit that they are not beyond the realm of possibility because of
No,
these
but
capabilities.
yeah, that's I think we're on the same page. Yeah, I don't think I think anyone would be foolish to say it's literally impossible. For a philosopher to say it's impossible, that's a pretty high bar.
Yeah.
Lots of stuff is possible. But of course, the possibility that X is no evidence that X, right? It's
Yeah.
possible that 5 minutes from now a bird's going to fly into my window that's next to me, but I have no evidence that's the case. And I don't think I should start preparing for a potential bird flying into my window just because it's possible. So I
Right.
agree it's possible. It's possible that some AI could get access to this and that, and it figures this out, it figures that out, even metaphorically speaking, figures out, and then blah, 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 um, you know, human destruction. Okay, fine. But I need to know a little bit more, I think, about the probability of such a thing if I'm going to say we should devote real political, cultural, capital resources towards mitigating that risk. Because if that risk is possible, but it's 0.00001%, and we've got other kinds of things like, let's say, climate change, that seems like a higher probability. I'd rather devote our resources to that than start screaming about the possibility of a quasi-intelligent agent wreaking havoc on humanity accidentally.
I'm with you on that because one of the things that often happens is they will come back with the argument, yes, small probability, but when the stakes are so high, it's the small probability of ending everything. And would you take that kind of chance? But you look at what we're doing with climate policy right now, and we're talking about extremely high stakes of global civilizational collapse is not by any means beyond the realm of possibility now. The Atlantic Meridional Oceanic Current is at its tipping point virtually now, right? Or they're now projecting it may tip in the next 20 to 30 years. And if that happens, much of Europe becomes under ice.
Right.
Tons of cropland just disappears within decades,
Yeah.
while 8 billion people are food insecure already, right? So again, you can look at these scenarios and say the kinds of risks that we're imagining are no greater than the risks we already are neglecting right now. Risks of nuclear security. The risk of nuclear warfare from an AI system that's gone rogue is far lower than the risk of humans still setting
Yes.
off
Yeah.
nuclear conflagration today. So all the resources that we need to protect ourselves from existential risk, get in line, AI people, because there's a
Yeah,
lot in
exactly.
front of
Yeah,
you who have a much greater claim to those resources and attention.
totally. Yeah. So let's now talk about the mirror metaphor because even though you and I are beating up on the AI people, or a lot of the AI
By
people
the way,
anyway.
some of the AI people, because I work with AI people, and most of them are incredibly frustrated by the
Yes, good.
misconceptions about AI that get marketed because they make people money.
I think that's fair. Although I don't think Hinton is doing it for the money. I think he really is just
No,
fundamentally misguided.
right,
I
and I do you talk about the fact that there are true believers, right? There are the
Yeah, yeah,
shills and the scammers, and then there are the true believers that I think have been
yeah,
captured by a certain kind of
yeah,
illusion.
yeah. And we could talk about why that is. I wrote a draft of a chapter of a book where one of the things that I think is worth mentioning is I think that data scientists, computer scientists, et cetera, they have a kind of ego stake. Like they're in thinking and believing that they've created a new mind, right? There's a
And
tremendous amount of ego in being able to say, we have created a new kind of intelligence. We are gods now. They're making themselves gods by being the kinds of things that can create. And so it's another reason that I think we really have to, it's not money motivation, it's ego motivation.
100%. I say something similar in my book, that this power to think that you've made the thing that will either save humanity or
Yeah.
make you the most significant human in history. If you can,
Yes, exactly. Yeah, exactly. Totally. Okay. I could beat up on those people all day, but let's not. But one thing that I don't think either one of us are, we're not down on AI generally. I take it that this metaphor about AI as a mirror is employed precisely because not only is it more accurate, but you would think it's also more useful for making good use of AI. So
that's
tell me
right.
about the metaphor. Useful.
Yeah. And you're exactly right. I will say I'm more skeptical about generative AI and its capabilities, partly because how much they've been oversold, also because they're doing a great deal of harm with very little benefit to compensate for it. Um, Versus the kinds of machine learning technologies that are not the focus of my book, that are not trying to mimic or stand in for human intelligence, but are designed to be tools to solve very specific kinds of human problems. I'm a big fan of the use of AI to, for example, find new ways to engineer crops that will be more resistant to heat and humidity in the future.
Sure.
That
Yep.
is going to save lives, right? That kind of AI we need. We need the
Yep.
kind of AI that's going to be able to make climate modeling more realistic so that we know, for example, if the AMOC flips, is it going to flip in 30 years or 100? That makes a big difference to what we need to do.
Yeah.
I'd like less uncertainty around that, and if AI models help there, I'm all for it. So again, I'm for the kinds of uses of AI that are actually worth the cost economically and from an energy and water standpoint. Of course, AI isn't cheap from an
Yep.
environmental standpoint. We have
Yeah.
to be weighing
Absolutely.
its costs against its benefits. But the mirror metaphor I use in part because mirrors are useful tools. But they're also not magic, and we understand how they work, what they're good for, what they're not good for. And so, if we can get to understand the ways in which AI is like a mirror, we will make much better decisions about how to use it, and without having to see it as something that's evil. Or I see a lot of people, understandably, dismissing all of AI now as AI is a giant plagiarism machine. That's
Oh
an
yeah.
incredible oversimplification, but it's grounded in a real abuse of the opportunity to exploit artists and workers through the extraction of their labor by these tools in an uncompensated and non-consenting way. So I get the anger, I get the dismissal, but I really fear throwing the AI baby out with the bathwater, right? Because of this. But I don't blame, I actually don't blame the critics of AI for this. I think this 100% is on the shoulders of the people who've chosen to release AI in harmful and untrustworthy configurations. But going back to the idea that mirrors are useful, let's try to understand why that fits in the first place. Because there still might be a lot of people listening who say, look, okay, you've convinced me that AI is not a mind, but you haven't convinced me that it's like a mirror, right?
Yeah.
So think about the way that mirrors work. When you reach out and touch it, you don't expect to encounter something soft. You don't expect to encounter something that's going to give way. You don't expect to encounter something that's warm, right? The thing on the other side of the mirror is not a second face. You know that. You don't think you're looking at a second face unless you haven't passed the mirror test and you're 2 months old or something, right?
Yeah.
uh, you think you're looking at a reflection, and you know that a reflection is not a second body or not a second face. It's a different kind of thing. And certain aspects of it are actually quite impressive in their fidelity to your face. But the resemblance is incredibly shallow. In the same way, the outputs of a generative AI model, like a chatbot, and the kinds of things that appear like thoughts, structured like thoughts, sound like thoughts, flow like thoughts, that is no more mental than the image of your face in a mirror is spatial, right? It's, and if you press on it, if you press on that reasoning, if you press on that thought process of the model, it breaks apart. It doesn't show itself to have the properties of a thought. And that's what we see when we really encounter the limitations of large language models in being capable of genuine thinking and reasoning and understanding. It's because they're not minds, and the thing that they're reflecting are not thoughts. They're images of thoughts. They're reflected images of thoughts that are
Okay. So
composite. of human thoughts that it has ingested, that it is reproduced by using the same patterns and reactivating them.
Okay, so let me see if I have this right. So if we're just talking about a glass mirror, here I am. I look in the mirror. I see, me. If I'm nuts, then I think that there's another me there. That's another person. Let's
Yep.
suppose that I'm not nuts. And I think, okay, that's not a person, although it bears certain resemblance to me. It's not actually me. It doesn't have various properties that I have, like it doesn't have warm skin or a heartbeat or thoughts, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. And then I take it that AI is a mirror in that I take it, is this right? The sort of analog to the mirror, to the glass mirror is the algorithm or the model, something along
Great
those
thought.
lines. And instead of the me, like in the mirror, it's the data that I'm throwing into it. And the output is analogous to the reflection of the glass mirror when I'm looking at it.
Yeah.
And if I think that the data that I'm putting into it, let's say it's thoughts in some form or another, anything from
Repetitions of
anything
thoughts.
it could be a whole sentence, I don't know, Napoleon lost in winter or something along those lines, or it could be something like this person's credit score should be a 7, whatever it is, and then it learns credit scoring. Take the outputs to be genuine thoughts. That would be as ridiculous as thinking that the reflection in the mirror is actually me or another person.
That's right. Yeah,
And so
absolutely.
I could that's interesting. Now, one question I have though, so I can see the way in which the analogy works for showing how you might make a silly error, as we've been talking about for most of
Mhm.
this conversation. People do in fact make that silly error. Does How does the analogy not only help us to avoid error, but how does it, if it does, help us to make progress in thinking about developing AI, using AI, or something along those lines?
Great. So, a couple of things. First of all, when we use mirrors, we recognize their limitations and the ways in which they can endanger us. And we often create little guardrails to ensure that they can be used safely. So think about the mirror on the side of your car that has a little etching saying objects may be closer than they appear, to make sure that you don't rely on a distorting mirror in a way that's going to lead you to harm. Part of the whole work of AI ethics or responsible AI or trustworthy AI. People call it different things, but it's essentially from different directions trying to accomplish the same end. It is largely about trying to both build safer systems that are less likely to lead us to harm, but also build better guardrails to ensure that the risks that we can't avoid, because no technology is 100% safe, right? No technology is perfect. If there are inherent limitations or risks of these technologies that cannot be avoided, but can still be justified by the good that they can do, and that's important, even then, we still need the guardrails to make sure that we can interact with them safely. And we do this with every other kind of technology, right? We go overboard with this with other technologies, I think, that we haven't talked about, which is that mirrors face backward. Mirrors actually show us the past. It has to do actually with the way that, light takes time to travel. So anything in a mirror already happened. But this
Mhm.
is true for different reasons in AI mirrors, right? These mirrors are ingesting all of the patterns of human thought, human judgment, human decision making, human creation from the last several hundred years, right? With, of course, a bias to the most recent digital era
Very
that,
recent past, sure, yeah.
yeah, exactly. But we've digitized things. We've digitized Shakespeare. We've digitized all
Yeah.
kinds of. There's actually a fair amount of old material that makes its way into the training
Mm,
data,
yeah.
probably. But it's all the past, and it's all reflecting the dominant patterns of behavior and consumption and judgment that we know are often biased and unsustainable. So, one of the things that I find really dangerous about relying on AI mirrors as tools for automation and of human judgment and decision making is that all those tools can do is ensure that our decisions stay on the path they've always been on. All they can do is identify the kinds of judgments we've been making all along and then steer our future judgments on that same path at precisely the moment when humans need to be thinking about how to change how we think, change our values, change our habits, change our patterns of judgment and decision making in some pretty fundamental ways, or else we're not getting out of the next couple of centuries alive, or at least not in very good condition, right? Our patterns of economic thinking, our patterns of political judgment, our patterns of consumption are wildly unsustainable. And almost everyone I talk to on any side of the political spectrum admits that, right? In one way or the other, very few people are like, yeah, we just need to stay the course. We'll be good. Who have you
Right.
who thinks that's the plan, right?
Yeah.
Stay the course. We're in good shape. We're heading in the right direction. All our systems are nominal. Just step on the gas. No one thinks that's a good strategy for the human family right now. Everyone realizes that we need some fundamental changes in our institutions, the incentives that drive them, the systems of accountability that legitimize them, and the ways that humans care for one another day to day and the planet. None of those changes can be made by AI systems. All they can do is take the patterns of the past and project them onto the future and ensure that actually we don't do anything different. So, a lot of what my book is about is understanding that mirrors are tools for sort of inspecting where you are and where you've been. Mirrors are a good thing for looking around corners and magnifying stuff you might not notice, getting new angles on the reality already in front of you. Mirrors do not create the future. And if we start relying on AI systems that we believe are smarter than we are and can decide on the future in ways that are more trustworthy and reliable than humans are, and I think we very much are at that point because we don't trust other humans either, we are really in danger of allowing the past to eat the future.
I think there are three main things, and then I want to push a little bit on the last one. The first two, actually, it seemed like what you said was that the metaphor of the mirror helps us avoid the very two errors that the mind metaphor runs us into. So the first one that we said was that it leads to misattribution of properties to the AI, that it's intelligent, that it has a mind, that it has understanding, which could then in turn lead to further subsequent conclusions that we don't think are true, like it has moral worth or something along something. So one, it's misattribution, and if we recognize it as a, or use the mirror metaphor, we avoid that misattribution. In fact, that's the point of it. And then the second thing is that if we think about the mirror metaphor, we're not going to be prone to overconfidence in the way that we are if we think of the thing as being a mind.
Yep.
So that's two things to be said for the mirror. The last one that I want to just push a little bit on is it's something like the mirror metaphor shows us that AI is mired in the past in the way that the reflections are mired in the past because it takes time to get the reflection to our eyeballs, blah, 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 blah. So I guess I want to hear just a little bit more about what that actually looks like. How would it keep us held back? I get in principle, it's reflecting back previous things, but how in practice or sort of on the ground does it keep us dragged? Does it drag us back into the past? And relatedly, I can ask it things like I once wrote a sort of short blog post, philosophically minded blog post, and I gave it to, I forgot which, I gave it to both to GPT 4.0 and Anthropic's Claude. And I said, play the role of a professor of philosophy who's very insightful, blah, 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 blah. And what do you think is the most trenchant criticism you can offer of this piece? And ChatGPT was mediocre at best. Anthropic's Claude was actually pretty impressive. It took out what I thought was pretty good. So can't I then just use it to say, so listen, I know that we used to think that X, but give me the most trenchant reason for thinking that we should change our ways. And it wouldn't shock me if it came up with something that was interesting, persuasive, or plausible in a way that would help me get unmired from the past. So I guess I want to hear more about that, the mechanics of being dragged to the past.
Okay. So I'll answer your question in two ways. So the first is just to give you some very literal examples and then ask you to understand that these very literal examples extend throughout the way that AI works in every kind of output that it gives us.
Sure.
So the literal example is it comes from things like image models. If I ask an image model to show me, and again, some of these image models, they've been trying to tweak them and fix this problem, but it's amazing how hard it is to fix, which tells you how deep this property runs in AI mirrors, that they're regressive, that they actually drag the representation back in history. There was a really useful tool that Hugging Face put online called, oh, I'm forgetting the name of it, but it was a set of tools for looking at stable diffusion and showing the way that it would reproduce, but actually amplify social bias. If you ask for a CEO, you would get just a sea of gray-haired white men in suits. Now, even today, gray-haired white men are overrepresented in the C-suite, right? But they definitely aren't 100%. Likewise, if you asked for an artist, you would get all men. How long has it been, Reed, since all artists were men? And by the way, uniformly presented painters or whatever, fine, let's just take painters.
Sure, but
How
probably
long has
never.
it been since all painters?
Probably, I imagine there were cave women making cave drawings as well.
But and also they're all like sepia toned and wearing clothes that you could see painters in the 17th century, right? It's taking these kind of classic museum images of the artist and producing variations on that. Nothing in there looks like what a 20th century artist looks like, much less a 21st century artist. If you asked me to show you the artist right now, half of them would have piercings in bizarre places and tattoos, and they'd run across the gender spectrum and vastly diverse ethnicities, right? Artistic communities do not look like a bunch of bearded 30-year-old European men in sepia toned rooms with raw, undyed clothing. That's just not where you're at the present. So what I want you to accept is that property you can find in AI model outputs of almost every kind.
Sure,
It's not
sure.
always so starkly obvious and in your face, but it's
Yeah,
constantly there, right? And that regressive property is what I mean by dragging us back into the past, because it will make recommendations based on its data that actually are more like the recommendations that you would expect from someone who understood society as it was 100 years ago than from
yeah,
someone who understands society as it is today. So that's one thing. But in response to your second question about, I can get these models to say more interesting things or more surprising things. And I can get them to show me things I don't know or I haven't thought of. So how isn't that useful? Now, I don't want to say that it's never useful. And I'll grant that there are times when, for example, it would be absolutely impractical to expect you to do the research on your own to understand what the alternative views are to the position that you currently hold, right? But imagine a world where no one, and I understand this is not a realistic scenario, but just go with me here. Imagine a future world where no one actually asks anyone else why they hold the political views they do that are on the opposite side of the spectrum from yours. That never asks for arguments against your own views. You just ask ChatGPT what other people think and why they think it. Because if you ask your neighbor why they support the candidate for president that you do not, that's an uncomfortable conversation. You don't want to have an uncomfortable conversation, right? And
sure.
also, you don't trust your neighbor necessarily to be a particularly smart or well-informed person because they disagree with you politically. So, no, just go to ChatGPT and get that answer, right?
Right.
So first of all, you realize the kind of homogenizing effect of your understanding, that everyone is going to the same source to understand this, instead of a diversity of perspectives on why people might defend certain positions. But more than that, you're cutting yourself off from the ability to understand other people's views because you're not having those conversations anymore. Now, I can expand this to many other contexts, right? And I see this with my students, not my graduate students, the undergrads who are just trying to get through, and God bless them
Yeah,
because I understand, right? They hit a wall. There's a ladder that's going to get them over that wall. And you're sitting there as the instructor telling them, nope, don't go up the ladder. You got to
hmm,
climb that wall with your hands.
sure.
And they're like, that hurt. That's going to hurt. And I'm going to fall down many times before I get up over that wall. And I'm like, yeah, but you got to get over that wall yourself. And they're like, there's a ladder right here. That ladder has ChatGPT's name on it.
I think you're being too optimistic about the extent of sort of intellectual curiosity and inquiry that exists among most people now. I think that is it getting worse? Do you think it's really getting worse? It doesn't strike me that your academics, like, they can't imagine a world where you're not constantly, especially philosophers, can't imagine a world where you're not more or less constantly probing your colleagues or friends about what their reasons are for thinking what they do and assessing whether justification is sufficient. But that's a philosophers are a weird bunch, very weird, and
Yeah. I hear this argument all the time, but I absolutely don't buy it. Do you know how
Okay,
many
yeah.
curious people I meet every day? Curious people who aren't academics,
Mm,
curious people who just are fascinated and have learned a whole bunch about some little thing in the world that fascinates them.
mhm.
These are like people who work at the post office, people who are retired and not retired academics. Anyone who has a little bit of free time to pursue their interests and is not completely living just in a kind of moment to moment trying to survive, right? And in that form of desperate impoverishment that prevents people from even having the luxury of buying a book, much less taking time to read it, right? That's a social failure. That's not a failure of human curiosity. That's a failure to create the conditions under which people can
Yeah,
exercise intellectual curiosity. But
I'm
when
okay with
you
that.
give people even a little bit of road, actually, it's amazing that most people actually take it. Are there incurious people? Absolutely, yes. Are
Sure,
they the
sure.
majority of the population? No. Now, most people don't want to learn everything about everything. They have their own little areas that they're fascinated about.
Yeah.
Maybe it's birds, maybe it's local history, maybe it's food, maybe it's film, maybe it's cosmetics techniques, whatever. But once people get passionate about something, intellectual curiosity takes over regardless of what your level of educational attainment is. All that education does is give you the confidence and the opportunity to go down that road further. And so I very much believe that we are underselling human intellectual capabilities. And when you say that most people aren't most people not able to tackle these sorts of challenges, that's because we've been murdering public education in most of the most technologically advanced countries for 50 years. We've
Yeah.
been
I mean,
telling people that it's a waste of their time to learn anything other than what they need for their careers. And yet people still go on TikTok and go down a rabbit hole and learn a whole bunch of stuff about something they don't need to know. Or they have a pile of books on it or whatever. It doesn't matter how you learn. Intellectual curiosity runs deep in the human animal. We've got a lot of surplus cognitive energy that needs to get spent somewhere. And
yeah,
so I am a firm believer that actually, if you give people the resources and the opportunity and the confidence to expand their intellectual horizons, they absolutely will do it.
yeah, I didn't mean to imply that I don't think that people don't have their pockets of intellectual curiosity. I meant to be pushing it back against the idea that people would normally engage other people in sort of argument about the reasons for which they believe such and such. That everyone is would be a sort of a little Socrates poking at other people's beliefs,
Yeah.
but were it not for the presence of ChatGPT or some such.
No,
I
and
just
just
think
right, that's not what I was suggesting.
yeah.
I was just suggesting that, for example, there are times in which those kinds of conversations need to happen. For example, in the United States, when you're on the threshold of a critical election in which the futures that America is
Yeah,
facing are wildly different, that's a
yeah,
moment where these conversations actually might be quite useful to be able to have with people, right?
yeah.
In a democratic society. I'm
I
not
don't know.
suggesting
Are the people who are on the
they're
fence still capable of rational inquiry? I don't know. It's a
again,
pretty the decision's pretty stark.
it's not the case. That's not because we're incapable of it. It's because we've
Yeah,
allowed think about
yeah, I
the
agree with all that. Sure.
threads of anti-intellectualism in the US that have been politically popular for the last 30 years.
Yeah,
The
sure.
kind of
The
ridiculing
elites.
intellectual
Yeah.
pursuit and the attempt to suppress any general interest in the public in the truth rather than what they want to hear, right? Well, now people want to look at the end result of that and say, "Oh, look how stupid humans are. Look how subject to confirmation bias they are." Well, sure, you took those vulnerabilities and you exploited them to your maximum capability, and then you use that as an excuse to say we shouldn't invest in
Mm.
human potential intellectual growth, right? Because we're hopeless. We should just turn it all over to machines. That's not your view, but I do hear people
Yeah.
say that.
Yeah, no, that I really like that point. I have said one of the things that we're trying to figure out is how safe is an AI or an AI plus human, how safe is it to deploy in such and such a context? And part of that depends upon what's your baseline. What are you comparing it against?
Mhm.
And the thing that I would think I would normally say is it's got to be something like, is it as safe as the average person? Is it as the average human driver? Is it as safe as the best human driver? But what you're bringing to the fore, which I find really interesting, is that the relevant standard shouldn't just be people as they are now. The reason for that is that, yeah, maybe that's a relatively low bar in many cases. Maybe humans are really shitty at some things. And so getting the AI or AI plus human to be better than the human alone is not that difficult in a variety of contexts. But what you fail to understand, Reed, I know you didn't say this to me, but this is I'm sort of recapitulating what you said as an attack on my view, which I think is the right attack. You're thinking about humans as they are now by including sort of history that led up to what they are now, including the kinds of economic, political, social, et cetera, resources that were put into shaping the way they are now. But what we could do is think about how better can we reshape or redistribute resources such that we can elevate people and make the bar higher for AI to reach.
Yep.
Yeah, I think that's a great point.
400 years ago, odds are neither you nor I could read or write.
I'll start pushing it on people.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Reed. And thanks for a great conversation today.
No, it's my pleasure. Thanks so much, everyone, for listening. And now let me thank the people who have made this podcast possible. So, first of all, we have Delano Alexander. He's been with me since day one. He showed me even how to start recording a podcast in the first place. He does editing stuff. He's been fantastic, and he does really everything I ask him to and more. I've never met anyone else who just says so much. Yeah, I don't know how to do that, but I'll figure it out. What more could you ask for in a producer? Next up, Jennifer Strong, my podcast guru. I don't know what else to call her. She just has advised me on how to design the podcast, how to grow it, and she's responsible for, if you like, this kind of season 2 relaunch and everything around it. So thank you to you, Jennifer. Next up, Meg Marco, responsible for all the excellent artwork. Before I did the artwork, I didn't really know what I was doing. We put it together. It worked well enough, but I think Meg really did a phenomenal job bringing everything together. Garrett Lang, a sound engineer that I frankly don't deserve. He's just too good for this podcast. Don't tell him I said that, though. Next up, Benjamin Koltgen. He is a professor of philosophy who has helped me source guests, identify who's interesting, who has things to say, etc., etc. So without him, I wouldn't have anyone to talk to. And then finally, Ashley Wasilenko, who helps with all manner of administrative things, making sure that the podcast guests find their way to the podcast, can schedule the recording, get their bios and headshots, and really just keeping the show on the rails and me organized. Thanks to all of you. Really appreciate all your hard work.